Feeding periodicity and obesity. Do when and how often we eat matter? Feeding periodicity, also referred to as eating patterns, describes the temporal distribution of eating events across the day, or meal timing, eating frequency, and also specific eating behaviors such as breakfast skipping, night eating, and eating meals away from home. In this presentation, we'll be talking about eating patterns and how that may explain the current obesity trends. Meal frequency and specific feeding behaviors such as breakfast skipping and night eating will be discussed, and potential mechanisms will be introduced. What types of eating patterns do people follow? Two common eating patterns that vary in portion size and frequency are nibbling, consuming smaller portions more frequently throughout the day, and gorging, consuming larger portions less frequently. Individuals may also follow a grazing pattern, which is frequently eating variable portions over 4.5 hours per day. Grazing is often viewed as negative behavior because people tend to eat far more calories than they think without realizing it. The time of day that people choose to eat is also a part of eating patterns. For example, some individuals may choose to skip breakfast, and some tend to eat more at the later end of the day. In the 1970s, most people in the U.S. were engaged in eating 3 times a day. Nowadays, less than half of the population eats during these 3 peak times. The rest are eating outside of these times by having snacks between these 3 meals or even eating during sleep time. Because there's always food available, people are unconsciously eating all the time. This is reflected by our median eating occasions increasing from 3.5 in the 70s to 5 in the 2000s. Also, the minutes between eating occasions decreased by an hour per day. The BMI of the population has also significantly increased. If this trend continues, by 2030, almost 80% of the U.S. population will be overweight and obese. Do these trends tell us that increased eating occasions promote obesity? Let's start with epidemiological studies. In contrast to the trends, some cross-sectional studies show that men with higher eating frequency have lower overweight prevalence. Meal frequency looks inversely correlated to fat mass in both male and female populations as well. This data tells us that the more frequently you eat, the easier it might be to keep fit. However, there are some limitations that influence our interpretation of these studies. First, most of the eating pattern records were self-reported. There is a concern that subjects usually underreported them. Previous studies have suggested that when taking underreporting into account, eating frequency is positively associated with energy intake and body weight. Second, when eating occasions are more frequent, it is harder to define meal and snacks, and the portion size of each food consumed really matters. Furthermore, few studies measure subjects' energy expenditure and physical activity level, which also influences our energy balance. So let's look at some other well-controlled intervention studies. In general, when people eat 3 meals per day, we can see the differences in blood glucose and hormones before and after meals throughout a day. But they are more stable in those who eat 6 meals per day. Researchers suggested that without the fluctuations, people can control their energy balance better. In some long-term studies, scientists show that increased meal frequency may improve insulin sensitivity as well. Another study also suggested that when people give up their habitual afternoon snack for 1 month, their body weight and fat mass are significantly increased. On the other hand, when those who usually eat 3 meals a day started to eat an extra afternoon snack, their body weight and fat mass did not change. Because of the inconsistent results, whether increasing meal frequency is beneficial to body weight control is still uncertain. When considering breakfast habits, 2 feeding patterns are established: breakfast eating and breakfast skipping. For the past decade, breakfast skipping among males and females over 2 years old has declined from 20% in 2001 to 15% in 2010, based on the National Health and Nutrition Examination surveys. But this decline in trend may be due to underreporting, an issue found across eating behavior studies. Several observational studies showed that children, adolescents, and adults that skip breakfast are shown to have increased BMI, appetite, subsequent intake at lunch, and may not meet their daily nutrient recommendation. A 2008 study monitored breakfast frequency and body weight change among teens through questionnaires completed at baseline and 5 years later. They found frequency of breakfast was inversely associated with weight gain in a dose-dependent manner. There are also intervention studies that investigate causal relationships between breakfast consumption and obesity. In 2011, one randomized crossover study assessed the effects of breakfast skipping in 12 healthy male regular breakfast eaters. Breakfast skippers had an increase in appetite and lunch intake, however, overall intake was not different between groups. GLP-1 and PYY were reduced, but more importantly, the breakfast skippers had lower insulin sensitivity. Therefore, researchers concluded that skipping breakfast may cause metabolic and hormonal differences in response to foods consumed later. In another short-term intervention study in healthy lean subjects, which are randomized to breakfast and no breakfast groups, reduced insulin sensitivity was also seen in the no breakfast group compared to the breakfast group. The no breakfast group had higher total LDL cholesterol as well. There are limitations in both the observational and interventional studies on breakfast skipping. Lack of a standard definition for breakfast and what breakfast skipping is may introduce errors in studies. Breakfast meal quality is also a key determinant of effects of breakfast on BMI, but some studies fail to adjust for it. Researchers also found that breakfast skipping is largely underreported, which confounds the conclusions from observational data. Lastly, long-term studies, which may robustly show causal effects of breakfast skipping and BMI, are lacking. Some eating behaviors can also be associated with clinical conditions. For example, night eating behavior is often associated with night eating syndrome. Diagnostic criteria for night eating syndrome includes eating 25% of one's caloric intake after their evening meal, having at least 2 nocturnal eating episodes per week with abnormal sleeping patterns, morning anorexia, and significant distress. However, not all individuals that exhibit night eating behavior are diagnosed with night eating syndrome. Late night eating, when individuals consume at least 50% of their calories during the evening hours, is a common eating behavior that we will focus on in this section. What causes this eating behavior? First, let's look at the normal weight population. Researchers have investigated the effects that night eating has on food intake. Each macronutrient intake was evaluated over 5 different time periods of the day. Intake increased for each one as the day progressed, with highest intake between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. The satiating effects of night eating was also evaluated. Subjects reported feeling decreased satiety as the day progressed, with lowest feelings of satiety also between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. However, research on the obese population indicates that night eating can develop after obesity. In an 11-year observational study on normal and obese men and women, significant weight gain was only seen for female night eaters that were already obese. Therefore, obesity may contribute to the development of night eating patterns in specific populations. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with the need to understand the cyclic relationship between food intake, weight gain, and night eating. Does night eating cause obesity, or does being obese cause someone to engage in night eating behaviors as an attempt to lose weight? Improving research methodology and considering other aspects of one's lifestyle can help us to better define this phenomenon. To understand why the above-mentioned eating behaviors can influence our metabolism, we need to learn a little bit about their circadian clock system. Back in the days when we didn't have man-made clocks, human beings relied on an internal biological clock, or a circadian rhythm, to inform the running of their day and night. The circadian system in mammals consists of a central clock found in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN, of the anterior hypothalamus of the brain. Under normal conditions, the SCN receives signals from daylight to start a 24-hour cycle of clock gene oscillation. Then it communicates time-of-day signals to peripheral tissues via humoral mediators and neural outputs, which in turn regulate rhythms in nutritional and metabolic processes. It is now emerging that the molecular components of the clock system are also found within the cells of peripheral tissues. In addition to daylight, other time givers are able to entrain the peripheral clock. These include body temperature, meal times, and scheduled physical exercise. Feeding schedule is a powerful time giver for peripheral tissues involved in nutritional and metabolic processes, such as the stomach, liver, pancreas, and intestine. Research studies show that if rodents have access to food only during the light period when they are normally asleep, they will adjust to this feeding schedule within a few days and will display food anticipatory activity, including increased locomotor activity, body temperature, digestive enzyme activity, and GI motility, a few hours before food becomes available. Moreover, clock gene expression rhythms in these organs shift to realign with the new feeding schedule. These all happen independent of changes in central clock rhythm. Whether the same food and trainable oscillators exist in human beings is still unclear. However, these results provide a potential explanation of how eating behavior can influence our metabolic health. So, do our eating patterns influence obesity? Overall, there are conflicting results. Underreporting of meal frequency happens frequently in the overweight and obese population, which confounds the outcome of observational studies. Secondly, the portion sizes and meal quality of each food consumed greatly contributes to obesity and should be considered. Furthermore, energy expenditure should be taken into consideration in future studies. Finally, long-term studies are still needed to verify the outcomes we observed in short-term studies, and separate investigations on different populations is needed. Here is a list of research areas of the Ingestive Behavior Research Center at Purdue. Explore through the links if you are interested.